Hello. I wanted to, throughout this course, I will be creating videos for you so that I can explain things that are, they're important, and it's also much faster if I just say it than if I type it. And also it allows you not to have to read quite so much. Because history courses are definitely very top heavy as far as reading, and so I'm going to try to present material in such a way as to keep things interesting, and it's not just read chapter 1, read chapter 2. I prefer that we have multimedia types of resources so that it keeps you interested. So to start off, we have to set the stage, so to speak, because people say, oh, it's not important what was going on. It's all about, we have to start with, English colonization in the New World in 1607 with Jamestown. And that is important. However, we have to figure out why. Why did these people jump off a cliff, essentially? Why did they decide that they needed to come to the New World? What would possess them to do this? So you have to look at those kinds of questions. What was the incentive there for them? And if things are pretty good for you at home, you probably don't really care. You don't want to go and run off to a new world that is basically unsettled. Oh, well, it is unsettled. You don't have any, your family's not there. There are no houses. Everything, you're going to be starting over completely, and not to mention the fact that you are risking your life. If you make it, if you survive the trip across the Atlantic, you then have to face, and these people knew, they were aware of the Native Americans that were living there. They had heard stories, and so you've got to wonder what would get into their brains that they would want to come and do this. And everybody had their own reason, there are some reasons that we can say that they are generalized reasons, and everybody was a little different, of course, just like they're a little different now. Everybody's got their own reasons, but we can categorize those, so to speak. So that's just where we'll start, and every unit will have a video of some sort that because I do feel like I need to speak with you about the concepts that we're talking about, because there's so much that can be said about this history. To start, we have to start looking back with Europe and what the conditions were in Europe at the time of colonization, exploration before that. So we have to, you have to look at the conditions and what were things like in Europe at the time. So why would these people be exploring and colonizing in the Americas? Why were they exploring in the 1400s? Why then? What was the reasoning behind then? What was it? Why was it not 1200 or 1600? Why was it the 1400s? Who were the explorers? What would make them want to go off and travel the world into places that they really had no idea if they would ever come back, and many of them didn't. Why would they go and be gone on a world trip for 2 or 3 years? There again, they were risking their lives. And what were the results of this exploration and this contact? So you have to start basically, and this, you have to set things up. So you had all this overpopulation in the 1300s, 1400s. There were too many people. Quality of life was terrible. You were lucky if you lived to be 30 years old. Your quality of life was terrible, and there were too many people. They were subsistence farmers essentially in Europe. They were just getting by. Subsistence farming means that they were hand to mouth. There was no excess. There was nothing to help. There was no way for them to trade anything because they were barely feeding themselves and their families. So they were subsistence farmers. Well, you had this, the Silk Roads that you heard about and Silk Roads, it's not just one. There were many paths of the Silk Road, but there were the Silk Roads. And you also had trade that was going on from the Orient into Venice, to Venice, Italy. And so Venice, Italy was the New York the New York of the day. And so with the port and all of the trade coming in and out. Well, these ships all had rats. And so the rats had fleas. And the fleas carried the bubonic plague. And so when these rats came into port, the rats would get off the ships, all of the cargo containers or whatever it was that in the barrels that they were shipping. And so these rats, in the conditions in Europe, were not clean in these cities. And so you had, raw sewage in the streets and animal dung and those kinds of things. And then you had these rats. Well, you get bitten by the fleas that are on the rats, and the fleas have bubonic plague and they bite you, you get the bubonic plague. So what happens is in 1340, 1350-ish, you have this outbreak, this epidemic of bubonic plague in Europe. Well, you had 33% approximately of the people died. 33%. So you lost a third of your population in Europe. While this was terrible, and it was several years that this plague swept over Europe. But the upside of that, which is terrible, it sounds horrible, the upside of that is that now you have a lot more food. You're not so stretched thin. You have more food available all over Europe. Because of that, you have less density in the cities, so people can spread out a little bit. The cities are not quite as dirty. You don't have the horrible living conditions, and people start to live longer. They start to produce more food, and then they have quality of life that is better. They have leisure time. If you have leisure time, you can explore that your talent is making pottery, making baskets, making soap, making barrels, shoes, those kinds of things. So your quality of life goes up because you've learned a skill and you become an artisan. If you're an artisan, then you have products that you can sell to other people and you become specialized. So your quality of life is going up. In that respect, then you have the Renaissance, because people suddenly have leisure time. They can worry about education, about reading, about producing art or music or theater or those kinds of things. So the bubonic plague basically allows the Renaissance to occur. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, you have in 1450, you have people, now these people have been trading with people in Africa. They've been trading with people in Asia for centuries. However, the people in the western, the western end, the western peninsula of Europe, which is basically Portugal, the Portuguese looked west because they were sort of like the black sheep of the European family. And so they were kind of out on their own, while the Spaniards were a part of the club with the rest of mainland Europe. Well, the Portuguese started to look west, as opposed to all the other Europeans were looking east as far as trying to find trade routes, faster routes to the Orient, more economic opportunities. But the Portuguese looked west. So you have they were going south to Africa. The problem with this was that, given the technology of the day, the sailors, once they sailed south, they could not sail back north up the coast, the western coast of Africa. So they wanted to sail south to check out what was going on in sub-Saharan Africa. However, they could cross the Sahara Desert, but that was that was time consuming, it was expensive, and it was miserable. So they said, oh, we can go south, but then we have to walk back north. We can't sail south. Well, you have Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry is the second son of King John of Portugal. Well, with the laws of primogeniture that were in place in European society at the time, all of the inheritance was given to the oldest son. So if you were the oldest son, your life was set. If you were the second, third, fourth son, your life was not set, because you basically got nothing as far as an inheritance. You had no job. Because you were royalty, but you had no money, and so you had nothing really to do. Many of the second and third sons became adventurers, which would be conquistadors, explorers, and those kinds of things. If you look at the different explorers, you'll see that many of them were second and third sons of well-to-do fathers. So Prince Henry was one of those people. Now, Prince Henry did not go and explore, but he facilitated everybody else's. He would set up a navigation school, and he employed scientists, cartographers, meaning map makers, and all sorts of weather type observers. They were scientists, basically. They developed the Caravel. The Caravel was an innovative ship that had different shaped sails, and it sat really high in the water, and as opposed to the traditional ships that were heavy and bulky and lunky, basically, and they could not make a turn and sail against the wind. So this Caravel was revolutionary. He also was instrumental in developing all sorts of tools and navigational tools and instruments that helped sailors and captains to figure out their way on the seas. So Prince Henry the Navigator would be one of the most influential people around. He has not been studied very much until recently, and once people got into the Columbian Exchange and the situation, we started looking at what the situation was in Europe. This is when Prince Henry became much more important than he has been in the past. So this is Prince Henry. He was the main guy who was influential in the Age of Discovery. He worked on the exploration of Western Africa, the Atlantic Islands off the coast of Portugal, the Cape Verde Islands, and the Azores. And then he never went anywhere. You can still go to his school now. You can still go if you were to go to Portugal. But these are the different instruments that he was influential in creating, in inventing, basically. So this is the Caravel, and then you have the astrolabe, and so these are just a few of the different types of instruments that he is responsible for. So now European sailors could go south and then expect that they were going to come back north. Well, this makes a big difference in the as far as setting up the slave trade once they can get to sub-Saharan Africa. So they discover that there's the West African Kingdom of Mali, which is huge, and it's an Islamic university that's at Timbuktu. What is interesting about this is that in the last couple of years, scholarship shows that there were up to 20% of the slaves that were imported from Africa were actually Islamic. Up until this time, people had thought they were pagan, that they were just pagan. But I think it's that the Europeans didn't look closely enough to see what their religion actually was, and so they just assumed it was pagan, when actually, in fact, it was Islamic. So many of the slaves that came here were Islamic, and that's a new development that's been recently found. So the Portuguese set up what are called factories, and they are forts basically, and they're trading posts on the coast. and each of all the way down the African coast, the Europeans, as they got into the slave trade and to trading with the Africans, it's like they divvied up the land and they staked out their claim on, in this area, and then the next group, the Dutch had their own area, the Spaniards had their own area, the English had an area, the French, and then the Portuguese, basically, they all had their own claims to a part of the West African coast. So the Africans had slavery for years, centuries before the Europeans ever showed up on the scene. They had been trading the other Africans. They had all been enslaving each other for years and years. And I think people always tend to say that this is only a thing that happened in the American South. In fact, that is not true. Every society has had slavery at some given point. You had the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the ancient Egyptians. Everybody's had slaves. The sub-Saharan Africans had been trading in slaves with for prisoners of war and those kinds of things. So it made a difference. This kind of put a different spin on it. But the Portuguese were trading in gold and slaves. So it was, and the reason was Portuguese, they actually treated their slaves very well, but they brought the enslaved people out to the Azores and the Cape Verde Islands to work on their plantations, because they had sugar plantations out there, so they needed cheap labor, of course. So what is interesting is that this disrupts African communities. It inhibits the expression of African cultures, their tribal identities, and over time changes the nature of the African civilization over a period of 300 or 400 years, because you're taking out basically the youngest, healthiest young males for the most part. You're taking them, and so that means how many babies won't be born, how much work won't be done, how much development won't be done, because they left the women, the children, and the old people. So it changed African society as well. This is just the beginning of that, though. So this is an image of a slave factory from back in the day. And so I just wanted you to see what it would look like. The Portuguese trade was big business, obviously. 40,000 enslaved people went to these sugar islands off the coast of Portugal in 50 years. So it was not, the enslaved population was very large out there. They had large-scale agriculture, and the Portuguese, even though they treated their enslaved people well, obviously it was not a positive thing for the enslaved people. I wanted to see how much longer I had. So you have these Portuguese explorers, and they keep pushing the limits. They keep going. They want a water route to Asia. They want to get around the southern tip of Africa and around into the Indian Ocean. So Bartolome Diaz, rounds the southernmost tip of Africa in 1488. Vasco da Gama makes it to India in 1498. Now you think about Christopher Columbus had made it to basically the Caribbean in 1492. So there's a lot of exploration going on during this period of time. Why was Columbus sponsored? He was Genoese, so he was Italian, and Columbus was he had been to the Venetians to ask for sponsorship. He went to Genoa to ask for sponsorship. Nobody would sponsor him. So finally he ends up, over a period of years, he goes to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, and they agree to sponsor him. Well, the reason was that they were able to do it then in 1492 was because they had recently expelled the Moors. The Moors had occupied Spain. The Moors meaning the Ottoman Turks. The Moors were basically the Turkish people. The Muslims had occupied the southern half of Spain for 800 years. And so once those Moors were expelled, Ferdinand and Isabella were looking to move west. They were looking to expand their empire. They had a little bit of extra money because they weren't having to fight the Moors anymore. So, and this is just a note, if you ever go to Spain, you can look and see it. The architecture in southern Spain has very much lots of Moorish characteristics. You can look and tell that it's not just European architecture. Their architecture is lots and lots of tiles, mosaic tiles, those kinds of things, and it's very Moorish in its character. And so it's actually gives it a great feel. Seville has a great atmosphere. So you can see the influence of the Moors in southern Spain even today. So now they're ready to move west. Well, they knew what the Portuguese were doing. The Spaniards knew, and it was a competition. They wanted to be the biggest and the best. And so Portugal was making all these strides in all of their exploration, and the Spaniards wanted to beat them basically. So you had this says 500 years, but basically the Moors had been in Spain for 800 years. So they had all of these issues, and after all this military and this religious confrontation, the Spaniards had developed this civilization or this society that they were obsessed with status. They were obsessed with society, honor. They were into religious zeal, and they were intolerant because they had been fighting Islam for so long, and they were a Catholic country. So they were very much into religion and making sure that the Catholics were the biggest and the best. They had a large class of men who thought that it was beneath them to do manual labor, and even commerce. Merchants were looked upon as low class, even though merchants, in England were pretty well respected, and they made plenty of good money. But these people who were in Spain, they were too good to do they didn't want to do any manual labor. That was, beneath them. So they're looking west as well. So Columbus, he's basically the globalizing force. You talk about global markets, everybody talks about globalism. Oh, globalism started a long time before this. So you have this interdependent global economic system that is a result. You have Europe provides the markets, the capital, the technology. Africa provides the labor, and the New World provides all of these raw materials, these natural resources, precious metals like silver and gold, soil for cane cultivation, and there's land to be had. Now at this point, Columbus doesn't know that there's land to be had. Frankly, he didn't know that there was a continent between him and the Pacific Ocean. He didn't realize that the Atlantic Ocean did not extend to the Orient. He had no idea that the Americas were here. And so for him, he thought he had arrived in the Orient when he arrived in Hispaniola. So he was unaware of what he had done. Even when he died in Spain, and was basically, he was not well-to-do. He had very little money when he died, and he was unaware of how he had changed the world. The Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal was signed in 1494, and it divided these heathen lands of the New World. Now, what they thought was this. So with this map, so you have Spain and Portugal here. The original line was here. This was the original line. And so the Pope, because the Pope basically was the political leader of Europe, because all these countries were Catholic, they go to the Pope and they say, okay, divide this up for us, and you're going to be the, the mediator. So they thought that because the Orient was in the east, that Portugal thought they had gotten this great deal, that they were getting everything east of this line, this Treaty of Tordesillas. This was 1493. Well, what they realized is that they sail very, very close to the coast of Brazil when they're coming around this, around the Africa. They don't sail close into the shore, they sail out. And I think a lot of this is like map projection issues, but anyway. So the Portuguese say, no, 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 we can't even, we will cross this line just trying to sail down to the coast, down to the Cape in southern Africa. So the Pope says, okay, we'll back it up and move it. So the Portuguese get this little bit of land so that they're not breaking this treaty every time one of their sailors goes south, or north for that matter. That is how Brazil ends up a Portuguese country, is because you've got, they're speaking Portuguese, and they still speak Portuguese in Brazil today because of this line. So they back it up, and now this is the line in the end that sticks. So Spain gets everything. As far as the Pope is concerned, Spain has access to everything. This is all Spanish property. So, but what they don't realize is that at the time, they have not gotten, the Spaniards have not gotten this far. They don't realize that there is gold and silver to be had. And so the Portuguese think that they got the best deal. And in fact, the Spaniards got the best deal because of all of the gold and silver that they found here in the Andes, and because of the silver here basically, and all the gold that they found with the Aztecs in Tenochtitlan. So the Portuguese thought they had gotten the best end of the deal. In fact, the Spaniards did, but they just didn't know it in 1494. So what did the conquest require as far as, if you notice these paintings all of these paintings, they have religious tones through everything. They see this as God's plan. This is divine intervention. They think that it doesn't matter that they're killing Native Americans, they're taking their land. They think that God has ordained this, and so they have, the crosses on the flags, and they think that they are doing God's will. So you have these 10,000 men that they have on these private expeditions that go. Pizarro and Cortez are major leaders in those. You had some of these conquistadors that were noble, but then you had another half that were either professional soldiers and sailors, and then you had the rest who were middle-class people. They were peasants or artisans. They were all very young, and they were basically great swordsmen. So you have the conquistadors did not bring families to the South and Central America. Hernan Cortez goes to conquers the Aztecs. Pizarro conquers the Incas. So you had why? What was the point here? Well, you had religious. You can always say God, gold, and glory, which is true. The 3 G's, you can always remember that. God, gold, and glory. But and that is really what they wanted. They wanted to gain God's favor by converting all of these Native Americans. But they didn't realize it was basically impossible to do. They wanted to become members of the royal court back home in Madrid. They wanted to get favors from Ferdinand and Isabella, and they wanted to do that by bringing in money, gold and silver, and by bringing more land and people under the control of the Spanish crown. They also wanted adventure that they had read about and knew about from the heroes in classical antiquity, meaning the ancient Greeks and the Romans. Very few got glory, very few got titles. They found out pretty quickly by the 1530s and 40s, the conquistadors realized that they were tossed out, and these administrators came into the Americas and administered this the government for Spain. And you have this encomienda system in South America that's set up, which is basically a plantation system. It's like plantation slavery. Many of the Spaniards married Indian women. That was not the case with the French and the English later on, but the new class of people were called mestizos. So they had these Indian women and these Spaniard men, and they had babies once they got married, and those people became mestizos. And so they were not supposed to be with these pagans, so they got their wives baptized in order to be in compliance with the Catholic Church. What is interesting is my husband's from Ecuador, and he is a mestizo. He is a mix of Spaniard. We did the DNA test. He has significant Arab blood. He has Spaniard blood, and he also has the indigenous blood, which means his relatives were Incas, down in the past. So he's definitely a mestizo, and it's a very interesting way of looking at things. But this is what the Spaniards and their conquest. This was a lot of what happened. They enslaved the Incas. They enslaved the Aztecs, and basically stole all their land, killed many of them, and stole their gold and silver. You have what is called the Columbian Exchange. This is a great graphic of the Columbian Exchange, and it basically is this is a good graphic for you just to see all the diseases that were brought from Europe into the New World and what was taken back from the New World into the Old World. The term Old World and New World, New World gives you a sense of the magnitude of this. For these people, the New World was like us going to the moon and living. And so you had, it was that big. It was a huge discovery. And so they were amazed by this. And the word New World, that's like us going to the moon. So these people in the Americas had not come in contact with anybody else from the Old World for between 11 to 15,000 years. They had been isolated. So and they were, basically spread out pretty much. And so you had all of these diseases that were transported on ships and all through Asia and Europe and Africa. And so the people there had a pretty good immunity to a lot of this. Well, the Indians did not. By the time the Europeans had been there for even 50, 60 years, about 90% of their population was dead from disease. It was not combat. These people were dead from disease. And these smallpox was a huge problem. But these others were also not too good. The only disease that came back with the Spaniard men was syphilis. The only disease that was introduced into Europe from the Native Americans was syphilis, and it came back via the men who had been involved with the Native American women. What's also interesting is that the Native Americans had never seen horses before. What that tells us is that the Native Americans had horses when they came from Asia across the Bering Strait, across the Bering Land Bridge. However, at some point, those horses, they died out. They migrated back to Asia, but the people across the board in the Americas that the Europeans came in contact with in the late 1400s had never seen horses. So we know that they had not been around for who knows how long, years and years and years. So there was no record of any horses ever being there. So that's pretty amazing that the horses had been, but then they left. So that is a quick and dirty on the first part of the course, and I will try to make sure that we keep it under 30 minutes if at all possible. Thanks for your attention and have a great day.